These days, APIs often allow partial updates through the HTTP patch method. We will learn how to consume such an endpoint in this module. We'll start by looking into the patch method and the standard to describe the request body of such a patch request, which is the JSON patch standard. We will also implement it and we will look into advanced scenarios. Before being able to do so, we will have to switch to another serializer, JSON.NET. We will learn why that's the case and why you may want to do that or may want to avoid that. Let's dive in. According to the HTTP standard, a put request should replace the current resource with a new one. That implies that all fields must be overwritten with whatever is sent in the request body. Put is thus only intended for full updates. However, you don't necessarily want to do that. It creates a lot of overhead because for you to change one field, you will have to send over all fields, which often also means having to get the full resource first. If you don't send over all fields and you just skip a few, the API should either remove those fields or set them to their default values, depending on how it's implemented. Therefore, the best practice today is to use patch for updates instead of put, as patch allows partial updates. So that means that we need a way to pass a change set to a resource using the HTTP patch method. In other words, we need to be able to describe such a change set. There's a standard for that, the JSON patch standard. You can find it via the URL on screen if you're interested. It defines a JSON document structure for expressing a sequence of operations to apply to a JSON document. You can look at that structure as a change set, a set of operations that will be applied to the resource that a patch request with that JSON patch document in the body is sent to. This is fully supported by ASP.NET Core, both at API level and at client level. Note that in principle, the application /JSON patch plus JSON media type is used to identify such patch documents. But most APIs tend to allow application JSON as content type for such a document as well. We're going to implement it as it was intended. Let's have a look at such a request body. Imagine that this is a patch request to a specific movie resource. It starts with straight brackets, which signifies an array. The array is a list of operations that have to be applied to the movie. We see two operations in the example on screen. The first one is a replace operation, signified by OP. Path signifies the path to the property, title in this case. And value signifies the new value that should be given to the title property, new title. The second operation removes the description of a movie. The operation is set to remove and the path is thus set to description. There is no value, as the property will be removed. Removing, for most systems, means setting the field to its default value. For some dynamic systems, it can mean effectively removing the property from the resource. Let's have a look at the other operations. The add operation will add a property at a path location with a specific value, passed through via value. If it is used on a path that exists, that property's value will be replaced. We just looked into remove, no need to cover that again. And we also looked into replace. No need to cover that again either. And then we have copy. That will take the value of the from property and copy it over to the path property. It's thus essentially an add operation at the path location with the value specified in the from member. Move will copy over the value at the from property to the path property and remove the value at the from property. So this operation is functionally identical to a remove operation on the from location, followed by an add operation at the path location with the removed value. And lastly, test tests that a value at the target location is equal to a specified value. So, we have to create a request message with such a list of operations as the request body. We can do that manually, but there's helper classes available for this, the JSON patch document class and related classes. We will use those in the demo, but first we will have to switch serializers. Let's learn why that's the case. So, we've been using system.text.json up until now. It's the default JSON serializer in ASP.NET Core, but it's not the only one. Others exist as well. JSON.NET is the most common one. Working with JSON patch documents requires using JSON.NET, so we're going to switch to that for this module. But is there a reason to use one over the other? Let's compare them. When comparing them, we are mainly looking at a difference in focus. System.text.json is relatively feature-rich, but its main focus is speed. In fact, the main reason it was created was to be able to provide high-performance JSON APIs that leverage modern additions like span of t. JSON.NET, on the other hand, is still very fast, but at the same time it also has support for a set of advanced features, like the ability to heavily customize serialization behavior, some pretty advanced ways of dealing with streams, and so on. Both are great choices and easy to work with. It's just that they have a different philosophy behind them. In an older version of this course, I mostly used JSON.NET, as it was still early days for system.text.json when I made that course. These days, however, system.text.json is more mature and supports almost everything you will need out of the box. It even includes support for iAsync enumerable, which enables async streaming and which we'll encounter later on in the course. That isn't supported by JSON.NET at the moment of recording. So, what you will want to use will, as almost everything of course, depend on your requirements. It is, by the way, not uncommon to use both in the same application. Use the best tool for the job at hand. For this module and this module only, we will switch to JSON.NET, because it is a requirement for working with JSON patch documents. At the end, we will switch back to the built-in system.text.json approach for the rest of the course. Let's start coding. In this demo, we're going to change the title and remove the description of a movie through a partial update. But first, we need to enable JSON.NET at API level. We're looking at the API's program class, where I conveniently added a bit of code to uncomment, which will override system.text.json with JSON.NET. There we go. That takes care of that. Back to our client. For this module, we will use the partial update samples class. It's currently mostly empty, so let's first inject a factory to create our HTTP client instances. There we go. Then let's add a method, patch resource async. What we want to do here is create a JSON patch document, in other words, a change set. But first things first. That JSON patch document is defined in the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.json patch assembly. So let's add a reference to that. We can find it on NuGet, so let's choose to manage NuGet packages. And let's look for it. Here it is. If you scroll down a bit, we see that this package requires JSON.NET. That is because the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.json patch classes that are used internally rely on the serializer respecting JSON property attributes. JSON.NET does that system.text.json does not. Let's add it. There we go. In the patch resource async method, we can now ask for an HTTP client instance and new up an instance of JSON patch document. There's two ways to do that. We can go for the untyped version, so simply newing it up, or we can use a typed version, like you see on screen. The untyped version is mainly intended for dynamic systems. In other words, those cases in which you don't have compile time classes to work with. If you do have those, like we do with our movie for update class, it's better to use the typed version, as it includes additional compile time checks to ensure that you don't make mistakes when adding the operations. And that's the next thing we need to do, adding operations. As we learn on the slides, a patch document consists of a set of operations. On the patch document, there are a set of helper methods for this. You can find methods like replace, copy, remove, and so on. Those match what we learned on the slides. We want to replace the title with a new value, so we call into replace. As we're using the typed version of JSON patch document, we can easily pass through the property we want to replace. In this case, that's the title. And as a second parameter, we pass through the new value. We also want to remove the description, so we call remove, passing through the description property. This is our change set to send. And what is next will be very familiar. First, we serialize this change set. Remember that we're using JSON.NET now. To use JSON.NET to serialize an object, we call into JSON convert.serializeObject, passing through the object we want to serialize. As you notice, the syntax is not that different from using system.text.json. And then we need to create the request message. That message has patch as the method and the resource URI of the movie we want to patch. The accept header is application.json. On to the content. That is still a string. So we again use string content passing through the change set. The content type is a little bit different though. As we learned, the correct type to use according to the standard is application/JSON patch plus JSON. So that is what we will use. And then we send the request, ensure that the response is successful and read it out. For this too, we use JSON.NET via a call into JSON convert.deserializeObject. Again, not much different from using system.text.json. That's it for this method. Let me set a breakpoint here, and let's make sure this method is executed when the application starts. So, in the run async method, we call into patch resource async and await that call. And then we switch to our program class and we make sure that we register the partial update samples class. So our DI system will provide an instance of that when an integration service instance is required. Let's give this a try. That seems to have worked. Let's scroll up a bit. If you look at our serialized change set, we indeed see two serialized operations. One to update the title, another one to remove the description. And if we have a look at our updated movie, we see that the description was indeed removed. In this case, that means setting it to null, and that the title was set to its new value, updated title. So here we go, our partial update was nicely executed. Is there a shortcut for this as well? Let's check out a shortcut for this in the next demo.